raise your hands survey here. How many of you are just starting, like you don't actually have any trees in the ground yet? Okay, couple, okay. Kind of, okay. How many of you have had trees for a few years and you're looking for some help kind of getting to do a little, okay. Alright. So it's probably most of you are kind of in that group. Anybody who's been growing fruit trees for years and years? Okay, all right. Come on in.
Hi. Oh, I'm sorry.
It's
I
got it.
was on time, but I walked all over looking for you.
No, you're good.
Sorry.
We just started, so it's much.
I couldn't figure out where people were.
Probably dark in here.
Sorry, everybody.
So what about how many of you are growing apple trees? Okay, so apple. What about cherries?
Just information.
Okay, pears. Anybody growing pears?
Yes.
Okay, some pears. Other stone fruit like peaches. Okay.
Yes.
What did I miss? Anybody just shout it out? Plums.
Cherries.
Cherries. Okay. Apricots. Okay. Most of what I talk about is going to be stuff relevant for apples, pears, and cherries. Although a lot of stuff about cherries can be also kind of applied to the other stone fruits. As far as the tree training and pruning stuff, with the caveat that sweet cherries and tart cherries are really different. So, but like your peaches are going to be a lot more like your tart cherries. So we'll talk about those a little bit, and let's see what else. Pest management. So, all right, this is a tricky one because it takes a lot of time to talk about pest management, and so if some of you are just getting started, then I want to probably spend more time on the tree care and tree pruning stuff. How many of you would rather I spend some time on pest management? A few. Well, I'll try to split it. I'll try to balance it a little bit, okay? So we'll do our best. And if you have more questions or specific questions about pest management, I can take those while we're doing the more informal stuff outside, okay? And I also have some really good resources that I can refer you to. So this is more for the folks who are just getting started. Maybe you've chosen a spot in your yard already for your trees. But if you haven't, or if you haven't maybe done a soil test in that spot, I would definitely recommend a soil test, because tree fruit really need pretty good drainage generally. They need a low pH. They're kind of on the low side. Not super low, but more acidic than not. And some of them can tolerate, kind of a neutral soil, but they really prefer slightly acidic, so 6.2 to 6.8 pH. And a lot of spots in Michigan, you're lucky. We're pretty lucky to have that naturally. Other places in Michigan, though, it might be more tending towards the alkaline. So knowing what you have to work with is good. There are things you can do to bring that pH down if it's not naturally where you want it to be, but they're not permanent. They're temporary fixes, and so they have to be you have to continue to do that. So what else? As far as the type of soil you're dealing with, the texture, if it's a clay soil, that can be pretty tough for like our cherries, but the apples are a little bit more tolerant of the clay. They like a little bit of a heavier soil, and if you're actually growing apples in a sandy site, that presents a whole bunch of challenges. It's not that it can't be done, but you do have to take that fact that the tree prefers heavier soil into consideration when you're getting your apple trees going. Talk more about that in a little bit, but none of them like wet feet really, so if you've got a low-lying area where water tends to be accumulating, a low water or a high water table, you might want to think about either putting them in a different spot or modifying it a little bit. So you can do what we call growing on a berm, where you make it doesn't have to be large, but a berm of soil, a foot high or so, 2 feet if you can, and then it's gonna provide a place for those roots to be that's a little bit elevated out of that saturated soil, give them better access to oxygen, which they really need. Those roots need that oxygen, so you don't want them sitting in a water saturated soil. Okay, here's kind of a graphic to show you tolerance to poorly drained soils. These are less tolerant, so these are the ones you want to have with really well draining soil. Blueberries, apples, and pears are a little more tolerant of that saturated soil situation. But yeah, here's the berm that you can use here. I guess the minimum is 6 inches, so you don't really have to get them that far up. Okay, I said a foot, but you can go even smaller than that. Okay, and that'll keep them happier. Okay, we talked about pH, sunlight, about 80% full sun. Okay, all day is best. If you can't find that, and don't forget to look up. This time of year, there's no leaves on the trees. Look up and think about what the situation is going to be when the trees are leafing out. Is that you're going to be shading these spots that might have sun now? If you haven't been living at that place and been able to watch it for a few seasons already, you have to try to imagine what's going to happen throughout the season. But the sun, here in northern Michigan, is more to the south early in the season, and then again in the fall. And yeah, you might have full sun in July, but are you going to have full sun really the whole year in some of these parts of your yard? And so trying to make sure that the plant's getting enough light, because if they don't get enough light, unfortunately what tends to happen is they don't produce fruit. You might have a tree there, an apple tree there, but it's not going to be a good bearer. It's not going to put out a lot of flowers, and it's not going to put out very much fruit. Okay. If you do have shade, only can deal, kind of a shady yard, raspberries can do well in parched shade. So think about raspberries instead. Okay, and then the cold hardiness. So this is definitely a thing to think about in the Gaylord area. Over on the west coast of Michigan, where I am most of the time, we have the Lake Michigan, that effect of large bodies of water that kind of are a buffer to these big swings in temperature. Here in the central part of the state, you don't have that, and you also tend to have really, really low, extreme cold winter lows. So this is an important table to look at. This is talking about flower injury. So on apple trees and other fruit trees, the flower buds are formed in late summer. So all winter, those little buds are sitting there on the branch with the flowers for next year waiting to grow. And so those flowers can be damaged over the winter by those extreme low temperatures. And apples, fortunately, are really adapted to grow in this really cold kind of northern climate. So they can get down to 30 below in those buds and not have damage to the flowers. Some of our other fruits, our grapes are one of the more sensitive ones, just on here kind of as an extreme example. The buds are going to get damaged at -8 to -15 Fahrenheit, and so then you won't have flowers on those grapevines next year. Similarly, some of these stone fruits are pretty sensitive to that. Now we don't get those temperatures all that often, but it can happen for sure. Even I think in Traverse City area, we had some negative double digits this last winter, one night. So, be prepared for that. You know, you might have some years where you get bud damage and you won't have a good crop if you grow these more sensitive varieties. Okay, so the other risk from cold temperatures during the bloom period, and I don't know how close we'll be to that here, but our winter or spring is kind of more on track right now with what historical average is. We're not, last spring we were really far ahead of our historical average as far as temperature, and so the plants were about 2 weeks ahead of where they would normally be. This year we're kind of back at what we would kind of call normal or historical average. So, you know, a lot of these fruit trees are still, the buds maybe are starting to swell in some warmer locations, but they're still really dormant, which is good because we're doing pruning and we want them to be dormant. But once they start to open and those buds start to show some green tissue and the flower buds start to come out, that's when they become sensitive to frost and freeze damage. So the later they bloom, the safer you are. So again, we have apples down here as kind of a later blooming fruit, and so kind of a good safe option for the Gaylord area. As we get more into the stone fruits, you're getting into kind of it's a little bit risky. And apricot is one that I know people love growing, and people love growing in my area too. But what can happen is it blooms so early that, you know, 3 out of 5 years you might just not get a crop because they get hit by a frost. And that, if you're okay with that, then keep growing apricot. It's kind of just, you have to have your expectations and kind of adjusted for that. So, you know, cherries tend to do okay, although every so often we do see a frost that hurts those flowers too. This is unfortunately a really old, kind of low resolution image, but hopefully you kind of get the idea. These are the development stages for flower buds on an apple. And I talk to folks a lot this time of year about, you know, protecting from frost and about pest management, because knowing these stages can be really helpful for pest management. There's some information, if you're interested in learning more about this, we have a lot of good extension articles on the website about specifically this with better pictures. But you know, this is kind of where they should be right now. Silver tip, where there's really nothing happening in the bud. Green tip is when you first start to see green tissue on our apple buds. Then we have 1/2 inch green, where there's about a 1/2 inch of green visible. And then here's tight cluster, where they're starting to put out actual leaves. Apple buds will have leaves and flowers in them. Not all fruit trees do that. Like our stone fruit have simple buds, so that's either going to be a leaf bud or a flower bud. Right? They don't put out these compound buds with flowers and leaves in them. And then here's full pink, where the flowers aren't open, but we're about to go into bloom. And as we get closer to bloom, these are more sensitive to low temperatures. They can still tolerate, I think I have a table here, yeah. This is percent kill after 30 minutes at the given temperature. So on apples, if they're at silver tip, you know, they can still tolerate cold temperatures, 15 degrees Fahrenheit, 2 degrees Fahrenheit. We get up to stage 6 here, with 6, full pink. They can still tolerate pretty cold temperatures. So 32, they'd actually be okay. But you get down to 25, 90% of those flower buds are going to be damaged. So that's a pretty big impact on your crop. So keep an eye on the temperature during bloom season is really important. Not necessarily because you can do anything about it. There's not much you can do on an apple tree growers have frost fans and things, and you know, it's a smaller tree, maybe you get out there and try to cover it with something, but it's tricky. But at least you'll know this year why you didn't have fruit or flowers that had bad frost. And sometimes help people who are like, why didn't my apple tree produce any fruit, or like 5 apples this year? And you know, the troubleshooting that can be really complicated if you weren't paying attention at this time of year to what might have been happening with frost and stuff. Because there's bugs that can do it, there's diseases that can do that, but it can also happen from frost. To protect from frost, you can choose locations on your property that are less prone to those colder temperatures. And cold air moves down, so let me get that graphic to go again. So just thinking about how air is going to flow in your property. The low, kind of depressed areas are going to collect cold air. Buildings and like dense brush can also trap cold air. So on a slope next to a building, you know, on the uphill side, not a good place to plant your fruit trees. So just it's something to think about too when you're choosing a place to put your trees. As long as the air is flowing, like a slight breeze, when it's really kind of right at the edge there where you might get a frost, flowing air prevents the frost. But stagnant air, it's like you're in trouble. So slopes are actually, gentle slopes are kind of a good thing, as long as, whoops, I just did something. And slopes are good because it does help air during, you know, these times of the year, the air will be moving more on a slope. But the problem is if it gets trapped and stuck. So we're gonna think about using varieties or species for your climate. We'll talk a little bit about size and growth habit. I'm gonna try to speed up a little bit because I do wanna cover the other stuff too. When you're planting them, again, we already talked about site selection. Important note about planting these apples and pears, you want that graft union. If you don't know where that is, take a second to look at your trees. If you haven't planted them yet, you know, they haven't arrived yet, or haven't bought them yet, when they come, look for that graft union. It's going to be kind of a swollen area where the rootstock is grafted to the scion. Okay, the scion is the fruit, the wood that's going to give you the fruit that you chose, the variety, the Macintosh or the Granny Smith, or that's the variety of apple, right? The rootstock is usually a different type of apple. It's chosen because it protects the top part from issues with the roots. They breed rootstock to be tolerant of diseases, soil problems, things like that. It might control the growth habit of the scion wood, so that's how you get a dwarf tree. You have it grafted on a rootstock that has dwarfing characteristics. So, at any rate, you don't want the rootstock to start growing apple tree. Okay, yeah.
Just curious, do you know what varieties often are used for rootstocks?
You know, I think, I mean, there's some really common ones that were developed in England years and years ago. And I think I have a list of them in a couple slides.
Okay.
But yes, those, but there are lots of other ones too. There's some like, traditional rootstocks that people have used for a long time. And really, if you're interested in doing this yourself, you know, you can almost use anything for rootstock, as long as you're okay with a full-size apple tree. But we'll talk about that in a minute. But the point I'm trying to make here is that you don't want the rootstock to start growing apples, okay? Because it will grow apples that are not like the ones you want to eat. And so if any shoots come out of here, you're gonna not want them to live very long. For the similar reason, you don't want the scion wood to start putting roots in the soil, okay? Because it will lose all those characteristics of dwarfing, of disease resistance that the rootstock gives them. So you want that graft union 2 to 3 inches above the soil so that the scion doesn't put roots down. All right. Make sure you remove the tags because they can girdle the stems. Keep them, And if you can find a way to maybe put them on a stake or loosely attach them in a way that they won't hurdle, and keep an eye on them, then okay. But it is important to remember what the tree was, and so keep that tag and find a way to keep track of what kind of apple you have in that spot. But you don't want to leave it on the tree. We say no fertilizer in the planting hole. Okay, we're mainly talking about like synthetic fertilizers. Okay, the stuff that comes in a bag and it's got a bunch of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium in it. Because those synthetic fertilizers are salts. Okay, they're not table salt, but they're that kind of chemical. They have the same effect on these new roots that are trying to develop and go out into the new soil that they just got put into. Those salts can be really detrimental to the health of those new roots. So we don't want to put anything in the planting hole, other than sometimes, it's not necessary. But sometimes if people are like, can I put compost in the hole, or can I? You do hear a lot of things on the internet and in other places about putting compost in manure or amending that soil in your planting hole. And some of that is okay, but you really don't want to alter that soil too much beyond everything else that's around it. Okay, the tree needs to spread those roots out into that surrounding soil and be happy in that situation. And if you create a planting hole that's really different from that, then the roots might not leave the planting hole, and then you get lots of issues associated with that. The tree's not going to thrive long term. Okay, it needs to be happy in its new home, and it needs to adjust to those soil conditions. Okay, best time to plant is in the spring. As soon as you can get a shovel in the ground, you can plant an apple tree. As long as it's already dormant. And that's, we're talking about like bare trees that come dormant and you can stick them in the ground. Fall is okay too. But really spring is a great time to do it. If it's a container tree, you can do spring or fall. Fall is a little bit less preferred for a container tree because it's a little bit harder for them to be planted. They're already in some material, that potting media, and you put them in a hole with all that potting media around them in the fall, and then you get frost thaw cycles, freeze thaw cycles, and the soil can kind of heave, and it can push that ball of potting media right out of the ground, and you come out in the spring and your tree is 2 or 3 inches higher than it was supposed to be, and that can be a bad situation. So spring is a better time to do it for that. Okay, so not grafting it above the soil, not below it. All right, we're going to talk a little bit about things to know about for pruning and training. Any questions about planting? So this is a really important concept for thinking about pruning your trees, and hopefully we'll talk about this out there when we're looking at some trees too, and hopefully you'll be able to kind of remember this image when you go out there. There's a hormone called auxin that the buds produce, and it kind of goes down the stem of the plant, and it's a communicator. It's telling the other parts of the plant what to do. All right, and if you have an apical bud, it's the one at the tip of the shoot, whether that's the main trunk, the leader, or a lateral shoot, that apical bud at the very tip of the shoot is going to be producing auxin. Now, some tree species produce less auxin, and some produce more of it in the apical bud. So we'll talk about the effects of that later, but generally speaking, you have an apical bud producing auxin. It's moving down the shoot. That auxin tells the other buds on the shoot to take it easy. Okay, it's like don't grow. I'm in charge here. You guys can just take a break. All right, and then as the plant starts to grow, you'll see that leader, that apical bud is gonna break. You're gonna get a lot of vegetative growth coming out down that shoot, and these other buds are suppressed. you know, depending on the type of tree it is, if it's more apically dominant, meaning that this bud has more control over the lateral buds, these will not put out a lot of growth, or they'll just stay completely dormant and they won't break. In an extreme situation, right? In our less apically dominant species that tend to be kind of bushier growers, this bud doesn't have as much control, so those laterals will still grow, right? But like in an apple tree, very apically dominant, you'll see a lot of suppression of these lateral buds. If you remove that apical bud, you get a situation like this over here, which means all those laterals are released from that suppression, and they can grow as though they were themselves an apical bud. They're gonna go crazy growing. And so the effect of this on a larger scale, if you're going around a tree or a shrub and removing all the tips of the shoots, like you might with like your hedge trimmers, if you're trimming a hedge, what happens is you get all this lateral growth. So you get a bushiness, you get a really dense canopy, and that's good if you're trying to grow a hedge, but that's not what we want in our fruit trees. So we generally try to avoid a pruning cut that just removes the tip. You know, even if you were to make the cut down here, you know, you still got these laterals that are going to break, and you'll get that bushiness. So that's a really important concept that we'll come back to a lot. We have these dwarfing, so apple trees are very much apically dominant. So these are apple tree examples, and you can see they're kind of growing straight up, right? Because that apical bud is suppressing all of the lateral growth, and you get this kind of, like, they tend to grow kind of like a Christmas tree, like a conifer, where they get that pyramid shape. There's not a lot of branching and lateral growth. But this is talking about dwarfing varieties, so we had a great question about rootstocks a second ago. These are different kinds of dwarfing rootstocks. Okay, these are the Malling series, which are the ones that I mentioned earlier that were developed in England. Dwarf varieties, and there's some other varieties thrown in here too. But the M27, we'll usually hear it referred to as M27, is kind of an extreme dwarf for an apple tree. And your Malin 27 will grow, it's on a Malin 27 rootstock, your tree will grow to about 20 or 30% of the standard apple tree. So not, you know, and just talking about a traditional apple tree, you know, they're gonna get up to 30, 50 feet. So, of course, you know, a lot of people like that dwarfing characteristic because they don't want a giant apple tree in their yard. It's hard to harvest the apples off of those trees. Once they mature, they take longer to produce a good crop. So our dwarfing varieties are a really good option because you can get a tree that doesn't get as big. You can harvest the fruit, you know, maybe on a step ladder at the most, and you have they come into yield maturity within like 3 to 5 years rather than 10 years, which you have to wait for that traditional apple tree. All right. But if you're growing dwarf trees, you need support. This is a great example of what not to do. This tree is probably a dwarf variety. They didn't really prune it properly. It probably was encouraged to put on a crop way too early. Usually in the first couple of years of these trees' lives, you want to nip off the flowers so that they don't try to grow fruit, because otherwise they won't have the structure, they won't have the strength, the limbs to support the fruit that they do put on. You want the tree to invest in vegetative growth in the first few years, in growing a strong trunk and a support structure for that fruit crop that you're going to let them put on in years 3 to 5. Okay? But you do need a stake, with most of our dwarf varieties at least. Some semi-dwarfs don't need a stake, and the classic traditional apple trees don't need a stake, but the dwarfing trees might need a stake or some kind of support, like a trellis system, throughout their entire lives. Unfortunately, one of the downside of the dwarfing varieties is that there's a lot of weakness at the graft union, and they tend to, when they start to bear fruit, if there's a wind, something like that, just a heavy crop load can bring them over. So support is important for the dwarfing trees. This is kind of what, is this a video? I can't remember. This is one of the, this is high density apples. You see these more and more now. They really were started as far back as the 70s, but we're putting dwarf trees on trellis systems and growing them in really high density. These are 18 inches apart. It creates this fruiting wall. It's really popular now with commercial apple growers because it's easy to do pest management in these situations, it's easy to do pruning, and it's easy to do harvest. It's not, maybe it doesn't have the aesthetic of a nice little grove of apple trees that you might want, but if you're looking for putting a lot of apples in a small space, this can be a really good choice. All right. Again, they do need support. Even a lot of these semi-dwarf need support. The pruning systems are going to be different for all of these. I'm not going to talk much about the high-density pruning system, although I will tell you that it's refreshingly easy. It gets a little complicated with these other pruning systems with apples. You can support your trees in a lot of different ways. Okay, a stake, a wall. You do need to protect the trunk from rubbing on whatever the support is. These are rubber bands that are used. They're not standard rubber bands, they're specifically for this purpose, but you can wrap them around the trunk one time and then around the support so that there's a rubber layer, a buffer between the support and the tree. Okay, this is a very oversimplified explanation of tree training and pruning. I'm going to do my best. We'll probably get a lot more done outside, but you have basically 2 or 3 options for how you're going to prune or train your apple trees. You have the central leader. That's the more traditional way. The apples really like that. Okay, it's hard to go against their natural tendency to grow straight up. So if you're trying to do anything then other than the central leader, you're working against the tree's natural habit. Open center is where you actually do remove that central leader and you encourage it to grow 3 scaffold limbs that are laterals, but they end up kind of each being their own central leader off, as a lateral. And that leaves an open center to the tree, and that's good for some of our stone fruit. Peaches and cherries tend to do well in this training system. It's more similar to their natural growth habit, but apples you'll be fighting against their natural growth. But people still do this with apples because it's a way to keep the fruit lower to the ground and more accessible. So it can be done. Espalier is just this, it's cool, and if you want to try it, I get a lot of people asking me about it, so I always have to put it in the presentation. And you can do it definitely with apples, and even sweet cherries. People are doing this in more of a commercial situation now with sweet cherries on trellises, and that's kind of a cool thing. But your central leader apple works really well with apples and pears. All right, they have this tendency to want to grow straight up, suppress that lateral growth. When you plant a tree like this, you're gonna head it, so you actually do tip the head off. Try to choose 3 or 4 branches that have a good, that look healthy. They're coming off the main trunk at a nice angle, which means not too steep. You don't want things that are coming off really close to the main trunk, so coming off at like a 45-degree angle. If it doesn't already have those that you can choose, then you might end up just taking all the laterals off, and then it'll put on some new growth. So this is what we call whipping a newly planted tree. and this is what kind of most commercial growers are gonna do regardless. They're not gonna mess around with trying to choose from this mess of shoots that are on the tree they got. They just cut everything off, wait for the next growing season. The tree's gonna put out, new laterals, and then the following spring or late winter, they're gonna have more to choose from that, right? If you're doing an open center tree, okay, we're strapping to my hands. Similarly, you're gonna retain 3 limbs, and then after the second growing season, you're gonna go through and you're gonna make sure you cut anything that's growing towards the center. Okay, because you want that, keep that center open. You're gonna head off these, cut the tips off of them, and keep that center open. And then this will be after the 3rd season. And year after year, it's pretty similar pruning process. As you're cutting off anything that's growing towards the center, you're gonna thin out some of this other growth. Peaches especially are just, there's a lot of pruning in peaches. You're gonna keep your pruning shears working a lot in these peach trees. But they put on a lot of new growth every year and have to be thinned a lot. But you're gonna be shooting for something like this every year for your peaches. And one way that a fruit educator that is retired now, but his way of kind of giving people a visual for what you're aiming for with something like this for an open center tree, you want to be able to throw a football through it without hitting any branches. So it's pretty thin. You're kind of going for a lot of space in there. Now we're talking about late winter, and you're creating all that space so that air and light can reach the center of the tree during the growing season. And you'd be surprised how much you can take out. And then in the growing season, it's going to fill in. There's going to be leaves and flowers and fruit growing in all those spaces. So it might look pretty bare now, but it'll be a good thing later on. If you want to do the espalier, I thought I had it. Oh, here we go. Okay. Basically, you're taking the leader out, and then you're training these laterals to a trellis or a wall. They're going to put up horizontal shoots. So these are, when you take a tree and you force it to grow horizontally, a lot of situations they're going to put up new vertical shoots. They want to grow straight up. This works well with sweet cherries and apples because they want to grow straight up. If you force them to grow horizontally, they're going to put new shoots up that are going straight. So then you get this, you train these new shoots up, and then, as you kind of imagine, just using that simple concept, you can do lots of variations on that and get all these different growth habits, okay? How we're doing on time, but I think I'm still gonna keep speeding through it here.
Very good.
I want to give you some ideas for apples to grow that are good for Michigan. This is from the Michigan Apple Committee, these pictures and some of the information. They're a great place to go if you want to learn about the varieties that do well in Michigan, the flavor characteristics, the ways they can be used in cooking or for eating. They're a great source of information. So you want to, again, make sure you're using varieties that are adapted to our area. Okay, soil type, cold hardiness. Even within the apples, there's a lot of variation in bloom time and in harvest time. So there are these early apple varieties that might be a good choice for this area, because if you have a short growing season, a short kind of window for that fruit to go from bloom and pollination to harvest, and they do need, in the late season, they need a lot of sun, they need a lot of heat to ripen those fruit. And so earlier varieties might be a good choice if you've got a short season. Disease resistance is really important. I cannot emphasize that enough, because if you don't want to be out there, spraying things on your trees all the time, choose the resistant varieties. Local sources of plant material are really good if you have them. And by that I mean small family-owned businesses that are selling fruit trees. Or just talk to your local farmers. Sometimes they'll give you cuttings and you can graft those yourself on the rootstock. But there are larger nurseries that can, from other states that can ship you bare root trees that are pretty good. But those are kind of, I think, get local if you can. And talk to your farmers markets, your farmers. So here's an early variety, Paula Red. I know this one does well in Michigan. It's harvesting as early as August 20th. It's a good eating apple too. Ginger Gold is a good one because it's early, it tastes good, it's a good fresh eating apple, and it's available early. And it's also a good pollinizer tree. So I didn't talk much about pollination yet, but apples need cross-pollination. So mixing in a variety like this that is good apple pollen with a lot of our other varieties is a good one to mix in there. Gala is one of our most popular ones in Michigan. Kind of not as early as the other two, but still pretty early. Susceptible to fire blight. We'll talk about fire blight there in a little bit. But it's a great multi-purpose apple for eating, but can be used in pies and stuff too. Golden Delicious, another one that's good for pollination, so as a pollinizer tree. Good for lots of uses as well. Jana Gold, kind of dual purpose apple, not as susceptible to fire blight, but still kind of susceptible. We're getting later in the season now. October 9th is our harvest for Ida Red on average. But that's a great one for cooking. Honey Crisp. So this one, how many of you are already growing it? Honey Crisp? Are you growing Honey Crisp? Yeah. It's very popular. People love eating it, and there's lots of good reasons to grow it. There are some challenges with growing it though, and commercial growers do it because there's a good market for them, and it makes it worthwhile. And also on a larger scale, the problems with Honeycrisp or the challenges of growing it are a little bit easier to manage if you're doing it on an orchard-wide scale. It has to do with nutrition and calcium in particular. There's some calcium imbalances that can happen in the tree, and it can also tend to overcrop, which means it puts on a ton of fruit in one year, and then it won't put on fruit the next year because it kind of used up all its resources, and so it can just be tricky to manage as a fruit tree. But if you want to try it, if you're doing it already, keep going. If you have run into problems, and we can help. But yeah, resistant varieties. This is a great article about resistant varieties, and my tip for finding extension articles like this is to go on like your internet search browser or search tool, whatever that is, and type something on the topic, apple scab resistant varieties for Michigan or something like that, and type Michigan State University, and search like that way. You can also go to the MSU extension page and type the topic, but unfortunately that search tool doesn't work as well, and you might not find it. So my tip is use your regular search engine, whatever that is, and make sure you type Michigan State University in the search. But this is a good article. It's just a list of varieties that were tested, done research, verified that these are resistant to apple scab. And apple scab is one of the worst diseases you're going to see in apples. It's always around, everywhere apples are grown. And so if you can get varieties that are resistant to apple scab, you will it'll make a huge impact on your need to be doing pest management in your
What does the scab look like?
Well, yeah, let me see. I think I have some pictures later
Oh.
linked to pest management, so I'll try to remember to go to those. Yeah.
Is apple scab, an annual disease, or is it chronic once the tree is infected?
It doesn't infect the tree, like systemically, so it doesn't stay in the tree tissues, but it stays around because it overwinters on the orchard floor.
So it's preventable if you don't allow it to get started in your trees, right?
Exactly. Yeah, and I mean it's yes and no because it's kind of ever present. It's on wild apples. It's airborne too, so it'd be really challenging to escape from it. But there are things you can do in your planting to have a lot less scab. Yeah. Pristine. So I mentioned scab because pristine is a variety that's really scab resistant. And a pretty good early ripening. It's got good flavor. It's a really nice apple, and I'm definitely encouraging folks to grow it. It's still susceptible to that fire blight, which is a bacterial disease, and we'll talk about that when we're out there looking at the trees in a few minutes. Liberty, another scab-resistant one. You may have come across this one. I feel like I see this more in grocery stores and farmers markets than the pristine, but it's also a good scab-resistant variety and some fire blight resistance. Pears, this is just a quick list of pears that do well in Michigan. I have a lot of question marks by Asian pears because I know folks want to grow them, but they're kind of marginally hardy, cold hardy for northern Michigan, and so not really a great option. Pears are very susceptible to fire blight, which is I mentioned earlier, bacterial disease. Apples and pears can get it. Pears get it so bad that it kind of destroyed the commercial pear industry in Michigan. We don't really have commercial pear growers here anymore, even though generally it would be a good place to grow pears. Fire blight just makes it impossible. But mainly choose the things that you like to eat, okay? You're gonna have a lot of fruit if you're successful, and you wanna make sure that you are happy to have all that fruit. If it's not, if it's a variety you don't like to eat or that you don't have use for, then it's, gonna be squirrel food, so. Okay, I'm gonna pause for a second before we get into the pest management section. I have a couple of handouts. These are surveys. The first one is from MSU Extension. It's a form that all of our funders request us to hand out to our participants. So this is information that helps us report back to those agencies like the USDA, the state and county government that help us do what we do at Extension. And it helps ensure that we are holding to this goal of reaching all Michiganders equally. So we're trying to make sure that our programs are accessible to all residents of Michigan, and we don't really know that unless we gather this kind of information. The forms are totally optional, and they are anonymous. And we do ask that if you don't want to provide information, you just check the box for a choose not to provide. That way I still get to kind of count you as a participant today. And the other form I have is more like a feedback form. This is one that I distribute and look at the data from to help me improve my future programs. And you can have both of these in at the end. Obviously, we haven't finished the program, so the evaluation one, the feedback form, maybe wait to fill that out until we're done. And you'll have a spot up at the front for you to set them all when you're finished, when we're finished. So I'm gonna give it a quick talk about pollination because it is an important topic. Flowers. Let's do a flowers 101. Okay, flowers have pollen and nectar in them, and it's the pollen that we need the trees to get to move around from tree to tree. That nectar is for insects. That's the tree produces that to bring in insects, and then the insect get the pollen on their bodies and move it from flower to flower to do what the tree wants. Okay? So pollination is simply the process of something. It doesn't have to be an insect. These are bees in this picture, but something moving the pollen from one flower to another flower. And as long as it results in the production of seed. So that pollen does have to be compatible pollen. It can't be, sunflower pollen going on an apple blossom isn't going to make an apple. So it needs to produce a seed. And depending on the fruit that we're talking about, pollen from the same tree might produce a good fruit. It might have to be pollen from the same variety but a different tree in some situations. Other situations, it has to be pollen from a different variety, the same species but a different variety. And that's what most of our apples require, is that it's a different variety of apple that the pollen comes from. So you've got fruit tree number 1 and fruit tree number 2. For cross-pollination to happen, we have one of those trees is what we call a pollinizer. Okay, that's the one that's donating compatible pollen to our other tree, which in some situations your other tree might be kind of your main crop. Your pollinizer might just be some crab apples. A lot of times if you look at a commercial apple orchard, there'll be scattered throughout it these random crab apple trees. And those are the pollinizer trees. In more of a backyard or hobby orchard situation, you might just have 2 varieties equally planted, and they just make sure they have compatible pollen. So one could be your pollinizer for the other one. Okay. It has to be a different variety, and it has to flower at the same time. So thinking about when they flower is important when you're choosing trees for your orchard. If they're closely related, they can't really be pollinizers for each other. So it's important sometimes to know, how a particular variety was bred. And a lot of times the name is a clue. So if Mac is in the name, like Ruby Mac and Marshall Mac, that's a clue that they're both bred from Macintosh, and you don't want to use them to pollinate each other. Golden Delicious is a good pollinizer, but it won't work for Gala or Jonah Gold because they were bred from Golden Delicious. Alright, so there's some things to know. Sometimes the nursery provides you good information about that. There's online sources that can help you choose varieties. You can almost always go with a crab apple, as long as it flowers at the same time as your trees do. Tart cherries, European plums, some sweet cherries, and some apricots don't need cross-pollination. So if you don't want to worry about pollination, cross-pollination anyway, you can plant tart cherries. And the sweet cherry varieties that don't need it, that information should be provided by the nursery. They're often marketed that way. They're like, this one doesn't need cross-pollination. So you shouldn't have to dig for that info. But often it's better, just to be safe, better safe than sorry. And plan on having some cross-pollination, because even if they don't require it, a lot of these fruit trees will do better if they have pollen from other varieties. And they all need bees. So think about those bees, especially at bloom time, but even after bloom time, because the wild bees in Michigan, they need good conditions year round to have a good population when your bloom comes around. So unless you're bringing in honeybees, or you're beekeeping yourself or something, because honeybees do a really good job of pollinating our apple trees and other fruit trees, but you need them in big numbers, and wild bees do a lot of pollination too, right? I talked about this picture earlier in a different context, but when you get good pollination, if you have a lot of flowers and then you have a lot of bees, all those flowers are gonna try to be fruit. And unfortunately, for most of our fruit trees, they're not actually set up to support all that fruit. If they put on that full load of fruit, they're gonna be low quality fruit. They're gonna potentially cause things like breakage, especially with like our more dwarf varieties. The more that we've bred these trees to produce a lot of fruit for us, the less that they have the characteristics that they might need to like support that weight of all that fruit. So, you know, we kind of created the situation for ourselves by breeding them that way, but it's just a little bit of management, which means thinning the fruit. What thinning looks like, in the early life of the tree, you're moving all the fruit, the first year, maybe the second year, because you want to encourage vegetative growth. After that, in subsequent years, our apple trees do something called June drop, which doesn't always happen in June, but you'll know it when it's happening. You'll notice there's a bunch of fruit lying at the bottom of the tree. You know, small, immature fruit. They drop to the ground. The tree just starts to drop fruit. And it's usually doing that with fruit that are poorly pollinated or have a pest or a disease issue. But another part of that is the tree is trying to actually reduce its crop load itself. And so you're gonna wait for that to happen because the tree is doing a lot of work for you. And then after that, you're gonna thin the fruit. So one fruit for apples and pears per 4 to 6 inches. For plums, it's 4 to 5 inches. For peaches, it's 6 to 8 inches. And while you're doing that, you're gonna look for fruit that may be damaged, might have signs of insect or disease problems, and take those off as well. And all that fruit, yeah.
I might have not heard you, but at what point do you do that?
Oh yeah, well in apples anyway, it's after what we call June drop, which is kind of when the tree naturally drops fruit, around sometime in June. The exact timing of it isn't super critical. These other fruits, there's, I don't know off the top of my head, but there are like growth stages where you look at the fruit. There's like stone fruit, they have a shuck split stage right after bloom, and there's these different kind of things to look for as far as the fruit development that you use to choose when to thin. But it's sometime, they're probably mid-season. You're gonna be thinning them. Destroy all the thinned fruit. So the fruit that you're picking off during thinning, you're gonna destroy it. Also, when it does June drop happen, it's a really good idea to pick all that dropped fruit off the ground too, because that's going to have pests in it that can later on go up and affect your fruit that you're ready to harvest. So destroy meaning either bury it like in a deep hole, 6-foot hole, burn it, send it to your landfill. Don't just throw it in a pile in your backyard because the pests will find their way back to your trees. Composting, probably also not going to get rid of the problem and the diseases or pests, so destroy it is the best thing to do. So here are kind of our most unwanted pests that I'm going to talk about real briefly. In palm fruit, or apples and our pears, we have apple maggot, codling moth, and plum curculio. These are the insect pests that we're most concerned about. I'm gonna do a real speed lightning round here because I want to talk about diseases too. But apple maggot is this little fly. Okay, it lays an egg. This is the apple maggot. It's got a pattern on its wings, and you can use sticky traps, which people use for lots of different things in orchards. You'll catch these on a sticky trap, and you can actually identify them by this, when they're stuck to that sticky trap by a pattern on their wing.
What about an apple cider vinegar mix? Are they attracted to that?
Not this kind of fly. This is
Okay.
different. So,
Okay.
we call them fruit flies, which is actually the scientific common name for them. But they're a completely different family from the things that most people think of as fruit flies, the little ones that come around your kitchen in the fall. And for more information, I don't have any of these with me to sell today, but you can buy these from the Extension bookstore, and it's a great guide for IPM scouting in apples. There's one for stone fruit. Come up and peruse it later. You can order it online, and it's like, I don't know, $12 or something. It's not too bad. super good resource. It has all this information and more on it. There's fruit flies like this, tephridids, for cherries too, and they can all be, I kind of tell them apart by looking at these patterns on their wings. Okay, they lay these tiny eggs, and then you end up with these little maggots inside of the fruit. You can sometimes tell heavy infestation, the fruit gets kind of distorted like that. There's good ways to trap for these. The traps don't get rid of them. It just tells you when they're around, and then you can do things to protect your fruit from them. All right, they have a pheromone you can use. They do just tend to be attracted to red. So red with a sticky coating on it, a red ball, or people have even used like those red plastic drink cups. They can get those, spray a sticky material on them. You can get the sticky coating. It's I don't know if every garden store or hardware store would have it, but it is something that you can buy in a spray can, and it's like the stuff you use for like glue traps for rodents. And then codling moth. Okay, this one is the worm in the apple. All right, and you're gonna see it and anywhere you have apples, you're gonna get codling moth. They do fortunately kind of let you know they're there by pushing this. This is their frass. This is their chewed up, partially digested apple bits that they're pushing out the tunnel. 2 to 3 generations per year, so they show up pretty early, and then they can continue to reproduce on your apples until harvest time. There's some good controls for these because they're so common. I mean, it's worldwide the number 1 pest of apples, so a lot is known about them. There are ways to deal with them. Puncroculio is one that you'll see in all of our fruits almost. And it's probably, this is one that I guess I worry about the most for a lot of you, because it can be really devastating, and it's a native insect. So these other ones I've talked about, came from Europe or Central Asia, wherever the tree fruits that were growing came from. But Puncroculio came from Michigan, North America. So it's a problem because it's everywhere. It lives in our wild areas, living off on hawthorns, and then it just shows up in your orchards. It does kind of give you a clue, again, that it's there. And these are these scars on the fruit. And this fruit actually, as you can tell, is kind of a mature apple. And you'll see these on mature apples. Really, you can see sometimes if you're looking closely in your grocery store apples, especially if they're organic. This just means that Puncroculio laid an egg on it and made a scar, but the egg didn't survive. So it's actually okay to eat these. But early in the season, you'll see that scar, and that tells you they're Puncroculio laying eggs and potentially infesting your fruit. Okay, these are the ones that on the June drop, when they drop to the ground, that's why it's so important to pick up those June drop apples, because there's Puncroculio probably in there, finishing development, and then they'll come out as adults and they'll actually feed on the mature fruit in the fall. So you want to do anything you can to reduce their numbers. Okay. Okay. Again, there's a cherry fruit fly. Okay, Puncroculio. Looks like a little piece of dead bark. It falls really easily. Plays dead, kind of if you approach it. So you might be able to see it there all the time. There are good traps for this though. So look for pheromone traps for them. Actually, it's not a pheromone. It's an attractant. It's a fruit volatile that they use to attract it. But there's good traps for them. Again, the traps don't get rid of them, but it tells you when they're showing up. And you can then use that information to protect your fruit. All right. I'm gonna skip ahead. Okay, wait, no, we need to talk about this one. Okay. So now, talking about those little fruit flies that fly around your kitchen in the fall, this is actually one of those. It's in the same genus as that. We call them vinegar flies, the pomace flies that come around. They're attracted to apple cider vinegar. But this is a different species that was introduced, I don't know, 15 years ago or something to North America and made its way to Michigan. and it's from where cherries are from, which is Asia, and it is a real problem because it doesn't just lay its eggs on rotting fruit, which our other fruit flies do. It lays its eggs on healthy fruit on the tree. Often right about the time that we're hoping to harvest those fruit. And then the fruit will just turn to mush on us. You see those pictures very well, but these tiny little fruit fly maggots get in there, and there's going to be many of them in each fruit that has been attacked. The female has this ovipositor that's like a saw, and she cuts into the fruit, lays a tiny egg, and then continues on. They can lay hundreds of eggs. Their reproductive rate is really high, so we're seeing them hitting our cherries some years, just in crazy numbers. And they have so many hosts, alternate hosts in nature. So like a lot of our wild berry producing trees and shrubs, including our wild cherries, but even things like honeysuckle, invasive honeysuckle, autumn olive, asparagus berries can host this pest. So it's tough. And the good news is that it doesn't go after apples. But if you're trying to grow cherries or other fruits, it can be a real problem. All right. I guess the takeaway that I want you to get from this, they reproduce really quickly. If you're having an issue, if you know that you have them, harvest early and often, because if you can get the fruit when it's ready to eat or process, but they haven't, the eggs haven't hatched. Where's the eggs? The eggs are tiny. If the eggs haven't hatched, you freeze that fruit, you turn it into jam or something, tiny little egg isn't gonna hurt you, it's not gonna do anybody any harm. The fruit's totally safe to eat. But if it gets beyond that stage, if you wait to harvest, then you'll, like I said, that fruit will be kind of turned to mush like that. They tend to peak late season. So another bit of advice is if you're trying to grow cherries or blueberries is one of the biggest problems for these, for the fruits that we have problems with. Picking varieties that mature earlier, you might not get hit as bad with Drosophila, spotted Drosophila. All right. Oh yeah, stink bugs. These are more of a nuisance for the most part, although they do cause some damage to apples when they're feeding on the apples. They actually do this feeding early in the season, but later on the fruit develop and they have this scarring inside. And so it's something to be aware of because stink bugs and other similar species, plant bugs, feed on the fruit when they're younger. So if you're looking at your trees, like around that June drop time, you might notice these kind of bugs on them, and that's something to be concerned about. Okay, diseases, fire blight and scab are the biggest ones I'm going to talk about. And this, you get this shepherd's crook. Anybody seen this? Yeah, it's fire blight is another one of those diseases like scab that's really everywhere in Michigan, and so it's a constant thing that you need to manage. You can prune it out in season, so if you find these during the season, you want to take them off. But disinfect your tools. Talk about that when we're outside. Fungicides that have a copper active ingredient are also good for fire blight. They're not great, but they're better than nothing. But like commercial growers actually use antibiotics. They can get a special exemption because generally speaking, we don't want to spray antibiotics at a large scale in the environment. But they do have a special exemption for fruit growers in certain situations. So, but we don't have that ability to use antibiotics against this. So, copper-based fungicides are our best thing, but really the best tool is your pruning shears, and we'll talk about that when we're out looking at some apples. Apple scab is a fungal disease that causes leaf spots early in the season, and then also moves to the fruit. So you get these lesions on the fruit. The life cycle is that it overwinters on infected leaves on the ground, these leaves fall. Okay, they keep the fungal material still inside of them. They go through a little part of their life cycle in the springtime during wet weather where they produce these canidia on the orchard floor. That's when it rains, that water splashes those fungal spores up onto the newly emerging leaves. So this is happening, if you remember back to when I was talking about bloom, right at that early stages when the leaves are first coming out of the buds. That's when they're going to get infected. Your primary infection for apple scab is happening then, if there's wet weather. So keeping an eye on weather patterns. If you you're lucky enough to have at least early season where it's dry, the conditions aren't right for scab, then you're gonna have a lower less of a scab problem that year. But that's not typical. Usually Michigan springs are pretty wet, so we usually have a lot of problems with scab. Some of our growers that I've worked with who do spray for scab are out there literally during the rain to spray a fungicide on the tree, on the leaves, because it's really important that your protectant product, whatever it is on the leaf before the scab spore lands on the leaf. There's no cure for scab or other fungal diseases once it's in the plant. It can't be dealt with after that. So your best defense is to have a protective layer on the leaves before the spores get there. But it's not, you don't have to go about it that way. A lot you can do as far as breaking up the fallen leaves, mowing the fallen leaves with a mower has been found to be really effective actually. Chopping them up, it doesn't take that much to disrupt this life cycle. So just running over those with a mower will do a lot. It speeds up decomposition, and by the springtime, these leaves won't be there anymore. The spores, the fungal canidia won't be around.
Can you spray that with that you spray the leaves?
No, I mean, the thing that I have heard people do with these is spray urea, which is a nitrogen. It's a liquid nitrogen source. It's a fertilizer.
Okay.
But what it does, if you use urea in the fall on these, is it speeds up decomposition. It's like really kind of fuels that decomposition by bacteria and other things. Yeah.
Would those fungal spores be able to survive through composting cycles? Is that an option?
I mean, it'd have to be a really good hot
The
compost.
hot.
Yeah. But yeah, I just don't usually recommend that because, backyard compost pile, unless you're really on top of it, typically don't get hot enough for killing those spores. But there are things you can do. Resistant varieties, again, are a really good idea, so think about that. Applications of fungicides, and there's lots of different fungicides that work against scab. It doesn't have to be synthetic commercial or synthetic chemical fungicide. There are natural materials that are like things you could use in organic agriculture that are available for scab. Those products are the ones where you do have to be out there using them a lot because they tend to not last as long, and they need to be reapplied often. But there are options out there. But you really do have to be out there a lot in the springtime to keep scab at bay. Now the good news is that if you do a good job during springtime, that life cycle, there's this primary infection phase that happens early in the season. And if they get on your leaves early, if it gets on your leaves early in the season, then it continues to cycle in the canopy. Like the leaves produce their own spores, and those spores spread to new leaves, and it probably gets worse and worse. But if you keep that initial infection from happening, then I would almost say you can just let it go the rest of the season, but you probably still would want to be checking for more scab because it could, one leaf is all it takes really, and it could grow from there, but, so you still wanna keep an eye on it, but it'll make things a lot easier if you do a good job early in the season. And you probably won't have to do a lot of scab management after that until maybe fall again, where you're gonna wanna stay on top of those fall leaves.
It says half inch at green, is that green on the stem, on the?
That's
leaf?
looking at the buds.
Okay,
So that image I showed way earlier of the growth stages.
Yep.
The buds have a half inch of green coming out. So again, just to review, I guess, sanitation, which that's when you're picking up those leaves, picking up those fallen fruit. Things like that are always a really good idea to keep the orchard floor pretty clean. There are a lot of pests like the codling moth that make cocoons and debris on the orchard floor. They might be cocooning in those fallen leaves. They might be cocooning in any kind of debris that's down there. So picking that stuff up, keeping it real clean in there is a really good idea. Traps for monitoring. There are lots of these pests, and I didn't have a lot in the presentation, but there are good organic options if you're interested in taking that approach to your pest management. Kale and clay is a material you can buy. It's in a formulation that can be sprayed on fruit trees in a conventional sprayer that provides like a protective coating. And it can be helpful for things like that plum curculio and codling moth. It's not going to help against the diseases, but it's a tool that you can use for some of these other pests. And then if you really don't want to be out with a sprayer at all, and you're kind of adventurous and willing to spend a lot of time putting bags on fruit, you can put these fruit bags on your fruit. It works. It's going to work for larger fruit, so I wouldn't recommend this for cherries or anything, but apples, peaches, pears, things that putting a bag over isn't as much of a big chore. You're protecting that fruit. A little bag can do a lot of good, and so taking the time to put it on, it makes it a little more worthwhile, right? But these bags, and there's information in the University of Kentucky about how to use them, specifics. But if you just have a few trees in your backyard, they're smaller trees, you could probably think about doing this. You put them on soon after bloom. A couple weeks after bloom, you'll put these bags on. It protects them from pests, insects, from diseases, until you take it off a few weeks before harvest. And that allows sunlight to reach the fruit, and it helps the fruit finish maturation. And then you've got a perfectly clean fruit. It'll protect them from things like that apple maggot that I talked about. And so it's an interesting choice or option if you want to think about it. Here's some good resources that I would send you to. Definitely these IPM scouting guides. There's one for cherries and one for apples. Or actually, I guess it's one for stone fruit. So it has stuff about peaches and cherries. And then the apple one. This publication from Purdue, if you're looking for kind of like, some people often ask us for like, almost like a calendar, like when to do different pest management things, like when do I spray for scab, when do I spray for plum curculio, when do I spray for codling moth. We don't have anything like that from MSU at this time. We're working on one, but in the meantime, the Purdue one is pretty good. We do have a fruit management guide that comes out every year. This is for commercial growers. You can buy it at the MSU bookstore. The new one would say 2025 on it. You don't want to use an older one because the recommendations, the products that are listed, because it actually does have brand names of pest management products, expire every year. So the laws are different every year for these pesticides, and so you can't follow old management guides. You might potentially be breaking the law. So, EnviroWeather is a weather network. Their website, enviroweather.msu.edu, and they have some really cool tools for even for scab management that look at the temperature and the moisture conditions, and you can get information from like a nearby weather station and it'll tell you what's the risk of apple scab development right now based on our current weather conditions. These are older publications, but they're still good. They're still free from download from the University of Wisconsin online. Growing apples in Wisconsin, growing pears in Wisconsin. I think there's even one for stone fruit. And just kind of have a lot of good basic information about pruning, about care. So that's it for this part of our day, but take a few minutes. There's some handouts up here. I have a sign-up sheet just if you want like the slides from this presentation. Put your email on there. I can send those to you. If you're interested in any other information from me, you can write a note on there about it. But take the handouts and a little bit of a tool petting zoo here too. If you want to look at some pruning tools.